Hey y'all, I'm Todd Clifford, preacher for the Burleson Church of Christ in Hamilton, Alabama. Thank you for joining us in our midweek Bible study this week. We are having our online or midweek services online for the time being as there's continued concern and more cases of COVID in our area. So in order just to be safe, we've gone to online for the next several weeks anyway, at least that long. But we thank you for joining us in this period of Bible study for this midweek service. Our title or our lesson tonight is called Lessons from a Fire. And we're not following any kind of series or whatnot, just doing some, for lack of a better term, some one-off type sermons and lessons that hopefully will be helpful to us as we continue to maneuver our way through the difficulties that we face each day with just life in general, with other things that are piled on top of it. And so I hope that what we have to say and study tonight will be a help to you. And so just, by way of introduction, thinking about lessons from a fire. When you think about a fire, I spend a lot of time on the road, probably more than most, at least most that live in our area. I drive about 25,000 miles a year, spend a lot of time on the interstates, traveling to meetings, vacations, visit family, things of that nature. And invariably, when you're driving down the road, if there's a car on the other side of the road and there's smoke coming out of that thing, everybody's going to slow down. Everybody wants to slow down, and in other words, that smoke, that flame, uh, draws, or I don't say demands, but it seems like it demands our attention. For example, a lot of times TV shows don't get things right, but one thing that they do get right is if there's ever a car or a building on fire in a city or a town, it always draws a crowd. And so there's something about a fire that draws people's attention. People will congregate and to watch, and they'll ask questions and all types of things about what started the fire. Is somebody inside? Just in other words, fire generates a crowd. It generates interest. It generates questions. I'm reminded of an old illustration about a church building that caught on fire one time, and as the fire began to engulf the building, and people were frantically trying to put it out as they were carrying the water in and out. One of the better known infidels in town was there to help put out the fire, and and the preacher said to him, "This is the first time in 20 years I've ever seen you at church." And he said, "Well, this is the first time in 20 years I've ever seen this church on fire." And so there's kind of a spiritual application there as well, that when churches are on fire, and I mean that in a positive, legitimate way, they're excited, they have purpose, and they have intensity. People cannot help but notice those types of things. And so just by way of introduction, the very concept of fire is intriguing, attractive in some ways to people. You think about some of the most well-known biblical accounts all involve fire of some kind. For example, when Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, God sent cherubim, and they had swords of flaming fire turned in every direction to guard and protect the garden from Adam and Eve coming back into the garden. Fire and brimstone was used to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord answered by fire in the case of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. There was the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. And so we could run a lot of events. The pillar of fire at night that noted the presence of the Lord as the children wandered in the wilderness. Just over and over again, lots of imagery of fire. The Bible says that this earth is going to be burned up, with fire. And hell is a place that burns with fire and brimstone, everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Matthew 25:41. And so, fire is an integral part of the biblical narrative. And so, but with that in mind, I want to think about things that we can learn from a fire. And when I mean learn from a fire, I mean when there is a fire where there is not supposed to be a fire. And the first obvious lesson is that, whenever we see such a thing, we learn that life is uncertain. Job said, "Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble." David said, "There's but a step between me and death." 1 Samuel 20 and verse 3. We think about, I heard recently a friend of mine knew someone who had perished in a fire. He went to bed that night, never even, thinking about such, and entered into eternity, being consumed by a fire. I can remember a number of years ago, and this one hurts my heart even thinking about it. One of my dear friends at church, Furman, and I were getting ready to go deer hunting one morning, and Furman came by the parsonage to pick me up. We were going to go, and I walked outside a little bit early, and I noticed off into to the east, that usually, and he'd come up it was going to come right about sunrise, and so usually the sky is starting to brighten in the east, but there was a glow to the east, and that was unnatural, and I thought, that's just not right. And so Furman came and picked me up, and I said, "Furman," I said, before we go hunting, I said, let's drive up the road here a piece and see what this is." And a mile or so, and looked to our left, and one of our members' house was just completely engulfed in flames. The fire had completely engulfed the house. We drove down the road. There was a car, there was a car in the carport. We had no idea if anybody was in there. If there was no way they were going to get out. Just for a moment, we were really devastated at the thought, of losing someone from church. And fortunately, the folks who lived there were visiting their family down on the beach and down at the Gulf and Gulf shores. And I remember making that phone call, and their daughter answering the phone, and I said, "Janie, there's been a fire, and your folks' house is gone." And she just screamed, and went to go get Martha. And it's just, I just remember, all the emotions that I felt, and then I can only imagine, what went through Martha's mind. My house is gone, my clothes are gone, my furniture's gone. Basically everything I own is gone up in flames. But, we were thankful that nobody was there. But not only with the loss of life, you have the loss of possessions, and these things are uncertain. They don't last forever, and an event like that certainly causes us to be mindful. Statistically speaking, I think about a fourth or a third of us can expect to be affected in some significant way by a fire in our lifetimes. And so it's interesting. Fire is so uncertain, and yet we know with some degree of certainty that we may well experience it, but we don't know when. And so we learn from fires that that life is uncertain. I think about Psalm 90 verses 10 to 12 that says, "Lord, teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." You don't know when a fire is coming, but you can be prepared. And it's just like our life. We don't know when our lives will come to an end, but we do know that they will. Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed unto men once to die. And so we don't know when, but we can be prepared as best we can for that event. And so we learn from a fire that life is uncertain. Then also we learned that things that can be a blessing are also a curse, or can be a curse. You think about all of the good, that comes from man's harnessing the power of fire. We think about our energy, our electricity. We call it a coal fire plant. And we think about, if you go back far enough, you think about steam engines that the water's boiled, and it takes a fire. You think about cooking over a fire and being heated by fire. Fire serves as a protection against, for example, maybe against wild animals if you're out and about. So there's so many blessings that come from fire, and yet what is a blessing can at times be a curse. And there are other things along that line. God created the tongue, but the tongue should be a blessing, but far too often it is, it's a curse. And James said, out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. And my brethren, these things ought not to be. James 3 verses 8 through 10. Recreation, rest has been given to us as a blessing. The institution of the Sabbath in the book of Exodus. The Sabbath was not established in the Garden of Eden. The Sabbath was given as a day of rest to the Jews as they were preparing to depart from Egypt. And but rest is, God realizes that we need rest. He realizes that we need to disengage at times and enjoy life. And yet we find that people take advantage, and what is meant for good is used for evil. And kind of, again, like fire. And we don't want to think in these terms, but sometimes our family, God gave us family for our good. You're talking, you're listening to a guy who loves family. My family has a family reunion every year, and we come from all over the country for spend 3 days together, or Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I love Thanksgiving because it's a time for family. I love Memorial Day because we have family and friends who come and stay with us, and these things to me are a tremendous blessing. But for some, their family is a curse. Their family consists of unbelievers. Their family may be infidels. Their family may be unbelievers in the sense that they don't support your religious practices and your religious beliefs, and perhaps maybe even openly attempt to persuade you to give them up, or they discourage you. And so the family is given as a blessing, but it can be a curse. And Jesus talked about these things in Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 32 and continuing through the verse 38, 39, that that a man's enemies come from his own household. Jesus spoke of that repeatedly, and also in Matthew 24. And so just so many difficulties that come from what ought to be, I would say, so many curses come from what ought to be used as a blessing. And so that's a second thing that we learn from a fire. But then number 3, we learn that and understand that fires do less damage when they are unfueled and unfanned. A fire left to itself will burn and it will smolder, but it can be managed. But we talk about throwing fuel on the fire or throwing gas on the fire. We talk about fanning the flames. And of course, I think most of us understand what that's all about. If you have a fireplace in your house or a wood burning stove, and maybe you remember having the little, and I don't even know what it's called, but it blows air and fans those flames, or gets those coals extra hot, so that they'll flame up and provide the warmth that you want. And so we're fanning those flames or adding fuel to the fire. I'm fixing to have to burn a big stump, and I'm gonna add fuel to that stump. Fuel for the fire to help it burn. But we also learned that bad fires will not burn as intensely if they're not fueled or fanned. You think about, for example, in Matthew 18, 15 to 20, so many times brethren don't deal with one another properly when there's a problem. And the Bible says if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. But so many people want to go to everybody but the person that the Bible tells them to go to. They want to talk to everybody else. They want to publish, their dirty laundry and maybe seeks support for their side or whatever, and they call people out, and it's just not it's just not helpful. And so that adds fuel to the fire. James chapter 3, verses 5 through 7 says, a tongue is a little fire, but it's a world of iniquity. It just takes a small fire to create a big problem. I remember when we lived in Arizona, there was a big fire that shut down. What was that? What interstate was that? I think it was 15, Interstate 15, that runs from Phoenix up toward Flagstaff. Could be wrong on that, but I think it's Interstate 15. But someone had just simply thrown a cigarette out the window, and it got in a little pile of dried dead grass, and the wind blew and it fanned that thing and went from a burning ember to a flame, and then from a flame to a raging fire, and shut down the interstate. Just a very small start created a big problem. And so we learned from a fire that the less fanning and the less fuel, the better. I think about Proverbs 26 and verse 20 says, "Where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no gossiper, the strife ceases." So much of the difficulties that we have in our lives could be solved if people would, well, for lack of a better term, to use an old phrase, if they just mind their own beeswax, and not getting involved in other people's affairs, or try to involve others in their own affairs. Jesus refused to be drawn into a discussion about an inheritance in Luke chapter 12, and so where there is no fuel, the fire, or wood, the fire goes out. Proverbs 26:21, "As coals to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife." And so more lessons about fueling and fanning. But then number four, there is a danger. Thinking about fire, there is a danger when combustibles are improperly stored. A lot of things in our houses are combustible. A lot of things in our shops are combustible. A lot of things in restaurants and other buildings are combustible, and they have to be stored properly. And if they are not stored properly, they increase the chance of fire. And I think about most big fights in a marriage or in a church are not over one big issue, but rather they're the culmination of a number of small issues. You're not going to have the big knockdown drag out just out of nowhere over one thing, but rather what's happened is we've improperly stored the fuel, and then the spark sets it off, and then we've got a world of trouble on our hands. That's why the Bible tells us to not let the sun go down on our wrath. And so with that in mind, we want to handle issues properly, and we want to handle them in a timely fashion so that they don't gather. Well, I just give you an example. One reason that there's so many forest fires, raging fires in California, is those knuckleheads won't let people go in there and cut the trees, and they won't let them do anything. Well, guess what happens? Trees grow. Trees die, they fall to the ground, they're creating fuel, and grasses and things grow, and then when you get a small fire, the culmination of the buildup of that fuel, and then you get a spark, and then it's out of control. But just for those of us that know a little bit, and I probably know just enough to be dangerous about the logging industry, timber industry. But we do know that controlled harvesting of trees, and cutting fire lanes and those types of things, clearing underbrush, are vital not only to the health of the forest and the animals. It's vital to preventing major fires. And so when we don't deal with our troubles and our problems in a timely and biblical way, those become combustible. And then it just takes the one spark to set it off. And so we know from fires there's a danger when combustibles are improperly stored. Then number 5, and there's 6. So we're getting close to being finished up. And this is a good thing we learn from a fire, that the application of fire reveals the value of a thing or a substance. Let me read to you, if you'll read with me, from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 And we will start in verse 11 and read through verse 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verses 11 through 15. I'm reading from the New King James Version. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire. And that fire, or the fire, will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. But if anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved as though through fire. And so what we find is that our work, our labors for the Lord will be revealed on the day of judgment as by fire. And that the fire will reveal the thing, whether it is good, or whether it, is to last forever, or will not last forever. Job said in Job 23:10, when he has tried me, I will come forth as pure gold. Well, how do you purify gold? How do you purify silver? Well, it's done through the process, of applying fire. And those things, those precious metals are liquefied by fire. And because they're heavier than the impurities that are inside of them, when that fire it melts them, then what's called the dross, the impurity, is, for lack of a better term, removed from the top, and it makes the product more pure. And God does the same thing for us. As we are tried by fire, God uses those trials to make us pure, to help remove from our minds, our hearts, any impurities, to make us more and better fit for service in the kingdom and to live forever with Him in heaven. Malachi 3 and verse 3, the prophet said, God sits as a refiner and a purifier. And I've heard this said, and I think it's probably true. The Bible doesn't say God will not put on us more than we are able to bear. It says that He will not allow us to be tempted above our ability to bear, but will with the temptation provide a way of escape, that we may be able to bear it. And so I heard someone say, if I feel like I'm being extremely tried and tempted, greatly burdened by some matter of life, then that simply means that God has an incredible amount of faith in me. That if He's not going to allow me to be tempted above my ability to bear it, then certainly whatever it is that I'm enduring is something that I can overcome. And I love that thought, that no matter how difficult life becomes, God is always there. He's always providing for us the way of escape. And then lastly is that we talked earlier about the need, to prevent fires. And certainly Christians ought to be about the business of fire prevention. The Bible says at the judgment, death and Hades will be cast into the lake of fire. Whoever's name is not found in the Lamb's book of life will be cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. And we know that Jesus spoke of those who will be cast into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, a place described as where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. We mentioned earlier Matthew 25:41 that hell is a place described as everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. In Jude, the 23rd verse, Jude admonishes his hearers to save others with fear, snatching them from the fire. Now, whether it be a non-Christian or an unfaithful Christian, either way, when we bring a lost soul or an unfaithful soul back to Christ, we literally snatch them from the fire. And of course, James said, brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one converted. It said, let him know that he that converts the sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death and hide a multitude of sins. That's snatching them from the fire. Proverbs 11 and verse number 30 says, he who wins souls is wise. The more that we can do to be soul winners, the more that we can do to prevent everlasting fire from coming upon our family, our friends, our co-workers, people that are in the world, the better off that we will be, and certainly the better off that they will be. So a number of lessons that we can learn from a fire. And so I hope that these are helpful to you. I hope that they encourage you. I want to thank you for joining us in our study for this midweek service. As always, we welcome your comments, your thoughts. You can put them in the thread. You can contact me through Messenger. I'll give you my Google Voice number where you can call and leave a voicemail or text. And that Google Voice number is 205-549-0066. And you can send a text or your questions to that number as well. But we thank you for joining us in our study tonight. Hope it's been a blessing to you. It's been a blessing to me to present it. And until the next time, I hope that you have a great day, a great rest of your week. May God bless you as you continue to study His Word.